Hey y'all, it's Erica, and I'm here today to do an author profile on one of my favorite authors, which is the most wonderful John Irving. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about John Irving in general, and then I'm going to tell you about the 9 books of his that I've read. I'm not going to go into the books of his that I haven't read yet because I don't know that much about them, and I'm really bad at synopses. So, John Irving has published 13 novels. His first novel was published in 1968, and his most recent was published in 2012, though I believe he has another one in the works that's due to come out soon. And I think he's a really interesting writer. So he writes, and I've seen interviews by him, and he writes the last sentence of each book first, and he works backwards through all of his plots back to the beginning. He was a wrestler in his younger days. He was actually inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1992, and he's also been a history teacher, and he's taught, since he became famous, he's taught at some MFA programs, including Iowa City's Writers Workshop. So that's kind of the background for him. Those are things that are pertinent to some of the books I'm going to talk about today. I've read 9 books by him, and I'm going to talk about them not in the order that I read them, but in the order in which they were published. So the first book that I read by him, and actually the oldest book that I read by him, is The World According to Garp. And this book I had seen pop up a lot on, like, best books of the 20th century lists and things like that. But I had no idea what it was about going into it. I knew nothing about John Irving. I just randomly picked it up in my bookstore one day. And I don't have my copy of it right now because I lent it out to my dad a while ago, actually. I should probably get that back. I really enjoyed it, and that's how this whole tailspin of John Irving fandom began for me. So, The World According to Garp actually won the National Book Award in 1980. It is the book that kind of set John Irving's career on the path that he's on today. He had published books previous to that, but none of them had been so nationally renowned. So this book allowed John Irving to actually become a full-time author. I'm not going to go too much into plot, but it is the story of a character named T.S. Garp, and it's kind of a coming-of-age tale. You follow him as he grows up, and it's also the story of his mother, who is a nurse at a boys' boarding school, and it deals with a lot of issues. It deals with a lot of sexual extremes. Like, there's some very odd sexual encounters throughout Garp's life, which are interesting. He doesn't have a father. He actually becomes a writer, which you'll see throughout John Irving's books. There's a lot of biographical tidbits that pop up here and there. A really great book and a really good place to start with John Irving. The next book in publication order that I've read by him is The Hotel New Hampshire. And this is definitely one of my top 3 favorite John Irving books. And it's not as well renowned as some of his other works, but I really, really liked this. This book is published in 1981, and it's a pretty intense family story about a family who owns a series of hotels, first in New Hampshire. They eventually end up in Austria. There's some fantastical elements, like the dad is obsessed with having a pet bear. There are some weird sexual things going on again in this book. John Irving has a tendency for that. He inserts really uncomfortable sexual scenes into a lot of his books, and his protagonists often struggle with their sexual identities and their sexual desires. This book, also interesting enough, features, like I said, the family moves to Austria, and John Irving actually spent some time in Austria, I believe, getting one of his degrees. So you'll see Vienna and Austria kind of creep into his stories as well. And this is a really eccentric, really fun book. It broke my heart a little bit. It's, like I said, it's a very intense family story. It's a very eccentric family. But I just felt like the characters were very well developed, and this is totally worth checking out, though I wouldn't recommend that you start here if you're trying to get into John Irving. The next one might be his most famous, and this is The Cider House Rules. This novel was published in 1985, and it was later turned into a film. Irving wrote the screenplay himself, and he actually won an Oscar in 2000 for Best Adapted Screenplay for the movie based off this book, which the movie is really great as well. I've seen that. I adore this book. It opens in an orphanage in St. Cloud, Maine. It's a really remote little village. And there's a kind of eccentric doctor there. But on the side, he also takes in a lot of unwed pregnant mothers, and he'll either deliver their children and keep them at the orphanage, or he'll perform abortions. The time in which this novel is set, abortion was completely taboo. Nobody talked about it. And so the doctor ends up in some political trouble because of that, obviously, and is frowned upon because of that. It's the story of the doctor, but it's also the story of his favorite orphan, whose name is Homer Wells. And Homer grows up in the orphanage until he is, I think, 18. And then a very young, lovely, pretty wealthy couple shows up at the orphanage one day to adopt a child. And instead, Homer ends up going home with them, and he lives on their apple farm. And then it sort of evolves into this love triangle. But all the time, there's this political undercurrent having to do with pro-choice versus pro-life arguments. Highly, highly recommend this. This, again, is a great place to start with Irving. And it's really heartbreaking, but it's really beautiful. His characters, again, are amazing. And I would definitely give this one a go. So I said that The Cider House Rules is probably his most famous novel, which I think it is in terms of reaching the largest audience because of the movie that was made out of it. But I have to say that I think among more literary types, that this gem might be his most famous and most beloved. And this is A Prayer for Owen Meany. And this book ruined me, like, a lot. This is one of the most amazing endings to a novel that I've ever read. I'm not going to spoil anything. You really don't want it spoiled for you. He wraps things up so beautifully in this book. This book is about two main characters. One is Owen Meany, obviously, but the novel is narrated by his best friend, Johnny Wheelwright. And in the beginning of the novel, something tragic happens, which kind of binds them together for life. And Owen is just this little tiny guy who comes from a family who doesn't have a lot of money, and he ends up getting very much into Christianity. There are a lot of Christian undertones in this book, but it's not preachy. It's not like that at all. Like, I personally am not a very religious person at all, and this didn't feel like preachy or weird to me. So don't avoid it because of the Christian undertones. Johnny, the protagonist, actually moves to Canada to become I believe he's either a history teacher or an English teacher. So again, there's John Irving's biography creeping in. And I adore this book. But I don't know. It's something to be treasured and not jumped into lightly. It's a big book. All of John Irving's books are pretty big. I mean, they all teeter around 600, 700 pages. But they move pretty quickly. So that is A Prayer for Owen Meany. The next book I'm going to talk about is A Son of the Circus. This was published in 1994. And honestly, this is probably my least favorite book that I've read by John Irving. I definitely don't recommend starting here. I don't even really recommend reading this unless you're already a huge John Irving fan. This one's very different. This book takes place in India. So it's set in Bombay, and it's set around this character called Dr. Farokh Daruwala. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I can't be sure. It's very eccentric. It's got a crazy cast of characters. It's kind of also almost a mystery novel. But again, it deals with some themes on sexuality and sexual preferences. And one sentence I know from the Goodreads summary of this book says that it's a pandemonium of servants and clubmen, dwarf clowns and transvestite whores, missionaries and movie stars. Which is absolutely true. Like, there are some wacky characters in this book. And I'm not saying that this is a bad book by any means. I did actually really enjoy it. I just didn't enjoy it as much as a lot of John Irving's other works. And I think it's because he kind of branched out here a little bit. He did something that he doesn't normally do. The next book I'm going to talk about is A Widow for 1 Year. This book was published in 1998, and it follows a protagonist named Ruth Cole, who is the first real female protagonist that I've seen from Irving. And this book follows her at 3 different times of her life, when she's a young girl, when she's a young woman, and then later in life, when she's older, she's a widow and she falls in love for the first time. It's a little warm and fuzzy for John Irving. I should know that John Irving's books are not necessarily warm and fuzzy feeling books. Like, things don't necessarily end well for his characters. His characters are amazing. They're so incredibly well developed. He builds some of the most memorable characters in contemporary literature, I think. But this one's a little bit more mushy. It's a little bit more romantic, but it's still, there's some weird sexual things going on here. When I say weird sexual things, I'm not talking about like kinky fetish type things. Don't get me wrong with that. They're not necessarily like normal by society standards, but it's nothing. Most of his books don't deal with anything too crazy. Now, this is a good one. This kind of falls on the middle of the spectrum for me in terms of favorites. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting here, but if you've read a couple of John Irving novels and want to know where to go next, this could be a good pick for you. The next one is my personal favorite John Irving book. Period, hands down. And it's kind of weird because you don't see a lot of people mention this as their favorite, and this is Until I Find You. This book was published in 2005, and it's a story about a boy who's trying to find his father, who has never been around as long as he's been alive. He left his mother a very long time ago. His father is a church organist who's obsessed with being tattooed, and his mother is a tattoo artist. So there's a lot of cool stuff in here about like the history of tattooing and different types of tattoos and things like that, which I found really fascinating. But the boy, who has, again, very troubled sexual experiences in his younger childhood, he ends up with a lot of much older women. He eventually decides that he's going on this journey to find his father. And it takes him across the world. He starts in Canada. He ends up, he spends a lot of time in Amsterdam, which is very cool. He spends a lot of time in the red light district. And he kind of moves from like tattoo shop to tattoo shop in all of these places and talks to all of these famous tattoo artists to try and find his father, because he knows that his father has been traveling in these general places, and he knows that he'll visit the famous tattoo artist there to get tattooed, because the man is literally like covered in tattoos. And I thought this was very touching, but really gritty at the same time, which I think is what John Irving does best. I think he writes very touching but gritty novels, and I find them to be pretty true to life. I mean, there's some fantastic elements in some of them, but I just feel like his characters are people you could meet anywhere. And that's how I felt about this. I felt like it was a little bit far-fetched, like with the obsession with the tattoos and then also being like a famous organist. That was a little crazy, but it felt so real. So I highly recommend this. I would say you could start with this if you wanted to get into John Irving as well, but I might read one of his more famous works first. But definitely try to get around to this if you can, because I absolutely loved it, and I would love to hear about anyone who has read it and what you thought about it. The most recent book of John Irving's that I've read is Last Night in Twisted River, and this was published in 2009. I really like this. I haven't read a John Irving book that I didn't like, that I didn't enjoy. Most of them are 4 or 5 star reads for me. This book starts off in the 1950s, and a 12-year-old boy and his son live in a logging camp, I believe. And due to some unfortunate circumstances, they have to flee and become fugitives. And they end up going to Boston, and I think then in New Hampshire. They travel around through New England and meet some really wonderful characters. And then it kind of evolves into a coming-of-age tale about the boy and how he grows up to become, again, a writer. I wasn't kidding about John. You can find bits of John Irving's biography in literally all of these books. This book spans 5 decades. And interesting enough, so if you're interested in learning more about how John Irving writes his novels, I mentioned earlier that he starts at the last sentence and works backwards. The protagonist of this book does the same exact thing. So this, I feel like, is the closest you're going to get to getting into the head of John Irving. Unless you read I believe he wrote a memoir about the making of the Cider House Rules movie. So maybe that'll be the closest you can get to getting into his head. But if you want to read his fiction and get into his head, this is the way to go, because there are some serious similarities going on there. Again, this is really great. I wouldn't recommend starting here, because I don't think it's one of his best novels, but it is a really, really good novel. So yeah, those are all my thoughts on John Irving today. If you want to know more or have any questions, please let me know. I would say in summary that John Irving writes some very chunky books. A lot of his books have undercurrents on themes of sexuality and political tension and sometimes religious tension. And I just think he's one of the most prolific writers still writing today. And I think his prose is beautiful, and I think his stories, again, his characters are so well developed. And I highly recommend you check out his books. If you've read anything by John Irving and want to talk about how you felt about it, please let me know. So that's all I have for you today. Thank y'all so much, and I will see you soon. Bye.